Okay, so we're gonna do a little bit of compositing and also maybe some adjustments and so on to try and strengthen the illusion of space. So I've got this, and if you can see, I've selected this statue um, basically with the quick selection tool. I've got a little bit extra in here. Um, Quick selection tool tends to be kind of the easiest to go with when you have something like this that's different than most things around it. Um, I'm just going to copy and paste. This is the landscape I'm going to put it in. And again, we're going to work on the landscape also. I selected the shadow because I wanted that shadow shape and I wanted it to work in this landscape. Sometimes it's kind of difficult to figure out how exactly is that going to work. Um, as in this case, what's important and the reason that I kept it was the shape, not necessarily the color, the texture, or anything else. Now, what I need to do next to be able to use that shape and use it in a certain way, I've got to separate it from the statue. And that's because I want to do some things with that shape to make it look like a shadow, but I don't want to do that to the whole layer. So I'm going to use the polygonal lasso tool. That will give me pretty much some straight lines where I need them. I'm going to start here, click, then do a straight line straight to here. Don't show again. Click and click, and we'll go up here, and then the rest of it really, because the rest of it is pretty much gonna be empty, so we don't need to worry about the rest of it too much. And what we're going to do now is cut that. So we'll remove it from that layer. And if we just paste, right, we'll get a new layer. And there it is. Okay, so we want to put it back in its place, right? So it kind of makes sense right there. Now, no need to do, we don't have to fill it with color or do anything like that. What I'm going to do next basically is burn it. And burning it just makes it darker. So if you look up here at the burn settings, got a nice size brush, range, midtones, exposure 24%, lets me go slowly. And we can go down here. Well, I probably need a little bit bigger of a brush. So we'll go down there. And again, it's not going to darken anything else because it's only affecting what's on this layer. So what's on this layer is basically just the shadow shape. So I'm going to darken this quite a bit, and I kind of rather do this. Some people just might take the shape and fill it with a color. But there's a certain amount of variation in something like this Whereas if I fill it with color, all that variation goes away. And I like the variation, you know? The variation in the end will make it seem a little bit more naturalistic. Now, you probably want the shadow to be a little bit darker, closer to the statue. That's kind of key, because naturally the shadow would be. All right. Now we're going to look at blending modes. And of course, that's key. Start with darken, multiply. And, you know, it's very hard to tell when you have this at 100%. So let's lower the opacity so the grass comes through. Let's try darken, multiply. Yeah, I mean, one of these is going to work, darken or multiply. So we'll go with multiply. And multiply is going to give us a little bit stronger of a shadow, a little bit stronger. We can always lower the opacity if we need to. The other thing that's key here, of course, is we're going to need to do a blur. Gaussian blur. Those edges are much too hard for shadow. So this is, it usually default is like around 1, but 1 would still be much too hard in terms of your edges. You go way up, too soft, you know. Ideally, your edges would be a little bit harder, closer to the statue, and then maybe a little bit softer as you go away. But we'll put it right around 10, I think. Click OK. And that looks like a decent shadow. Yeah. Okay. Now, I want to do something that shadow works well, but still looks like it's floating a little bit. That statue, the base of the statue. Look at it. So what can we do here? And again, when you paste in objects into your landscape, you don't want them floating unless that's intentional. And all you really have to deal with is that bottom edge. And, you know, there's ways. So let's look at that. Yeah. How could we deal with this? I mean, what would naturally happen? It would sink into the ground a little bit. You should see some grass maybe coming up over the edges, right? Since we have some grasses here. So, in this case, what we want to use is the clone tool, clone stamp tool. So we're going to do that, clone stamp tool, okay? Clone stamp tool, the way it works is it replicates pixels. First you pick a sampling point, then you go to where you want to put the pixels from the sampling point. As you work, the cursor is going to move in both places. So in other words, the sampling point moves along with you as well as, because otherwise, you know, it would repeat the same pixels over and over again. So, and we don't want to pick a sampling point that's like right in front of it, because then it'll look like a repetition. So we want to pick a sampling point that's a little distance, like maybe right here. So you option click on the sampling point. I'm going to option click right right here. Okay. Again, option click. And again, I'm on the wrong layer. That's another thing. Happens all the time with the clone stamp tool. Make sure you're on the right layer that you're sampling from. Then you may have to switch layers for where you're sampling to. And that's the case here. So I would, and again, I want to make sure that you can see that, but I'm going to option click right down here. All right, option click. And then I go up to layer 1. You can see it's kind of showing me what it has there. Here are the controls for your clone stamp. 36 is about right. Okay, opacity. You may not want to do this with full capacity at first. So, 50, 60%, something like that might work. And let's go into here, and you can see again, you might see the little plus sign where it's sampling from. Now, I might have to go over this a couple of times. I'm kind of getting a little bit of a shadow too, which I don't mind, that kind of starts to make sense. Let's get a little bit more grass in here, but maybe of the darker variety. So I'm going to click over this way. All right, again, go back to the base layer, option click over here. Well, maybe right here. Yeah, right here. Option click there. Go to layer 1. And it's kind of a dark. But we should get a little bit of grass in there. All right. And again, you can always tidy it up if you need to with one thing or another. But that's the idea. And again, most people probably wouldn't notice. You could fix this up a little just by getting some lighter tones in there. Now, another thing we might want to do, and it depends, but when you're copying and pasting like this, one of the things to keep in mind is your edges. Do your edges look, how should I put this? Unnatural, too hard, like they're cut out, stuck on, like that. So where the smudge tool is, there's also a blur tool, and you could smudge all these edges, but it would be a pain to do all that. So let's see if we do a blur. And if we do a blur, we don't have to sample all layers. Strength 50%, sure, that works. And let's zoom in a little bit, and you can see those edges of a few extra pixels in there. So we'll go back to the blur, see if we can get this to soften. Yeah, that's better. Soften that edge, It is going to make it a little bit more naturalistic, if you ask me. So you can see how, the size of the brush that you're using might also be a factor. I'm just using the edge here, not using the whole brush. But you can soften all your edges just like that, and that will really help. it will really help. So let's look at some other things in terms of distance, what we're looking at as a whole. Um, let me go to fitting this on the screen. And what I want to do now is I want to select a foreground area, and I think I'm going to do that just in front of the statue. So I'm going to use my lasso tool, and I'm going to draw up the side here. I'm going to draw, and you might try and do this kind of organically, maybe along with some of the shapes that you see. I'm just outlining now, going all the way back to the beginning. Boom. Okay. So that selection is my foreground. And before saving it, and you probably should save each one of these selections, right? Right. So before saving this, we want to feather the selection. That is, so you don't have abrupt changes. We're going to gradually change the field, the grass, so that, as you go back into space, the color changes more. We're going to exaggerate the difference in terms of space. We don't want hard edges where we make those changes. So we go to select, modify, feather. Yeah. And this is a lot of pixels. If I go back to, I can't right now, but if I go back to show, let's see, rulers gives me pixels, and you can see, just a little bit of space, 100 pixels. It's a lot. So I would say maybe that selection we're going to modify with a 50 pixel feather. Okay? And you can see that edge might change a little. All right? Now let's look at the difference as I change things. So what I want to do is play around with some of the tools that I have to play around with, and one of them is hue saturation. So saturation is lessened as it goes back into space, more as you get closer. So maybe we're going to try and pump up the saturation. Now, it's a good way here to test that edge. Doesn't show much, but let's see if we change the hue. Oh, let's get on the bottom layer, store it. Okay, so on the bottom layer, image adjustments, hue saturation, right? And let's push saturate. You can see the difference now. And you can see why the 50 pixels make a difference. Now, we're not going to go this far, but, plus 26, plus 30, yeah, it makes a difference. It does. So we're going to make about a plus 30 there, right? Click OK. And then we'll also go to image adjustments and do levels. Levels kind of is a more specific way of doing contrast. This will give you more darks, moving this way, give you more darks in general. But if you move them both, like move this one, more lights, and then move this one, more darks and lights. Yeah. That makes a difference, and you can kind of really start to see the difference now. Okay. Hopefully. So, yeah, that's really making a difference. I'm going to click OK. You can save this selection. It's a good idea when you're doing something like this, to save your selection. We'll save this as a channel called foreground. Okay. Next you kind of have a middle ground here, right? Let's deselect. And we kind of got to work around the statue, because the statue is definitely in the middle ground, for sure. So we're going to try and do basically a selection that would follow this line, the trees, everything from a certain point back. So you kind of decide where your midpoint is, somewhere around here. And so what we're going to do next is dull the color, dull the contrast, try and push everything back. So you want to think about where that, midsection is, and work from there back. You don't have to be perfect going around this, because you're going to have a feather on the selection anyway. And you don't have to exclude the clouds in the sky, really, because in the end they are further back, and they're included when you're dulling the contrast, dulling the saturation. So now I just drew a line across the screen. Basically, I have a selection that's from a line about here in the field, goes on an angle, goes back, includes the sky, goes around the shadow. And what I'm going to do now is kind of the opposite of what I did with the foreground, right? Makes sense. So image adjustments. So let's do hue saturation first. There's a couple of things. One, hue changes as you go back into space, in the sense that it kind of moves towards whatever the sky looks like. So in this case, it's going to become a little bit more blue. So you can play around with the hue here. That's a little bit too much. Yeah. But you can see we'd want to go in this direction. Maybe like ever so slightly. And again, it might be something that is almost imperceptible, but we'll change the hue a little. The other thing is that my selection, I did feather. Now here's a funny thing, because when the blue is kind of peaked, I get a brighter green, and I don't want that. So I'm going to keep it around where it was. Maybe just a little bit more blue in it, but not much. And the main thing is to take down the saturation. Just slightly. Take it down. Okay. All right. Next, also, we want to lessen the contrast. So we go to image adjustments. We can go back to levels. And again, daylight situation, generally speaking, the contrast is lessening as you go back into space. And mainly that contrast lessens by your darks getting lighter. So if we grab hold of our darks here and pull it down in this direction, it just means our darks are going to get lighter. You can see that, obviously. So I'm not going to pull it down too far, maybe to about 10. Makes a little bit of a difference, right? Not going to mess with anything else at this point. Okay. Now, another thing that we could do, you want to use everything in the toolbox, again, to emphasize the illusion of space, is use a blur. That means things get a little bit more out of focus, and that can exaggerate the sense of space. Now, when I have that turned all the way up, this is like a 10 on the Gaussian blur. Look at how that kind of exaggerates the space. It does. Almost, almost a little bit too much, obviously. So I'm going to put a blur on it right about there. Click OK. All right. Then I'm going to save this selection. And this is my midground. Okay. Now, background. Well, especially this edge, we want to really soften. We want that to sit back in space. So, you can kind of actually do as many levels as you want to. I'm breaking this up into maybe 1, 2, 3, and then 4. Kind of 4 levels that I'm really affecting to kind of exaggerate the space. So basically, I took a line straight across around the statue, and it's just before the ridge, and that basically is my background. We're going to soften that a lot. We can take a look first maybe at the color, and we did hue saturation last time. We're going to get to that, but let's do color balance first. And we're going to push everything a little bit cooler. This towards blue, towards green, towards cyan. And the one thing you want to be careful of is not going too far and ending up with a super blue sky. This is midtones, shadows. We can push a little bit more towards blue. Again, we're going to take some saturation out. Okay. That definitely does look bluer. Image adjustments, hue saturation. Let's lower the saturation. Okay. And that looks pretty good. Click OK. Go to image adjustments. Again, levels. We're going back towards the sky. We're going to lower the amount of how dark our darks are. Right? And that's pretty key. I mean, we could go, yeah, we could exaggerate it a little, right? Sure. Lastly, let's go look at the blur and filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Use Gaussian blur because it's kind of the most even. If we really wanted to push it, you know, yeah, you probably could in something like this where it's kind of a dream situation anyway. You could push that quite a bit. So I'm going to push it all the way up to 7, which is just, yeah, it's a lot. But again, we're exaggerating the space. And again, we should save the selection. This time it's background. Okay, selection is saved. Anything else we want to do there? Probably not, but let's deselect now and take a look at this compared to what we had in the beginning. Yeah, I think the space is exaggerated. I mean, and it doesn't look too uneven. It gives you kind of, if you've ever seen old photographs or photographs in low light where you have a really short depth of field. It feels kind of like that, and that tends to exaggerate the space. You could go even further, make the clouds really soft. You can go even further into the ridge line with a blur tool and soften that even more, you know. And particularly when you get that contrast, you know, like right there between the statue and that line, that ridge right behind it, gives you a real sense of three-dimensional space. Good.